today we're going to talk about something that, there's so much that Trump floods the zone with. So it's hard because you both don't want to run to everything and be at sort of his beck and call, both for your own sanity and because you don't want to really encourage things. I'm sure you have the same experience where you decline commentary on certain things because you just don't want to feed that. But then there are certain things that are very relevant. And then also things that you're just interested in. So, last week and the week before, it was all about the E-swing. And I thought the level of intensity and interest in it was interesting. It was before Caroline Leavitt's, press conference. And then people wanted me back to discuss it and see if I had any amendments. And I didn't. So what I do want to talk to about today is one of the things that I talked about that came up last week, which was about Trump's alleged third term. And the joke that I've been making is that third term just does so much better in focus groups than like dictator, king, despot. It just sounds better. So while I think there are a lot of factors, he's going to leave office already as the oldest president we've ever had. He doesn't look like he's, really the model of healthy aging, I think is a really generous way to put it. We know that he's having, they've as they always want to, given new definitions to words. So annual is now, I don't know, every 3 to 4 months, as far as visiting his doctor. But I think what we do want to talk about here is that this isn't a thought experiment. When Bannon says something and he uses words like providence, which harkens back to the founders, but also to evangelicalism, he's saying something which is a rehearsal for a performance, right? So if the insurrection wasn't planned from the inside and it was so poorly executed, you have to imagine that they would come back better, stronger. They clearly can organize and use their time well. That's what we've learned recently. And so we call this kind of thing democratic backsliding, which is this like slow erosion of everything, norms, checks, institutional memory. And so in last summer, I want to take you back to last summer. There was that moment that we all talked about, because we believed him, right? At this point, when he says things, we believe him. He said, you won't have to vote anymore, as if civics is some sort of like terrible obligation. We don't all enjoy posting our stickers. He told this crowd of conservative Christians in West Palm Beach, get out and vote just this time, and you won't have to do it anymore, my beautiful Christians. And so I want to talk a little bit, I studied the founding era, but also, my next book is on Kennedy. You study the 20th century, and I think you're conversant in all of it. Stepping aside from what it says in the Constitution, because we know that that's more of a vibe for the Supreme Court than a literal thing. How much do you think this is a thought exercise, and why are they talking about it now?
Well, it's nice to be talking with you, as always. I don't think it's a thought exercise. I understand there might be strategic reasons to talk about it now, meaning it certainly serves to distract attention from other issues. I think it's clear that there's concern about the effects of the shutdown. There's concern about the midterms. Otherwise, he wouldn't be going to such great lengths to work on redistricting and more. So this is a good thing to talk about for that reason. It's also good. I do think you have lame duck presidents, and the inherent nature of a lame duck president is people fear you less, even within your own party, because you're going to go away. And so I do think that there's a strategic element in that the more you talk about the possibility of a third term, the more members of Congress who are really the Trump base, as much as voters, will heed what he says and support him and create a firewall regardless of what's going on. That said, I think they're serious. I do think they're going to try to find a way, assuming he's healthy and assuming he wants to, meaning he doesn't want to, enjoy the money that his family is making right now as president, that he will run again. I think for Bannon, it's not so much about Trump. It's about entrenching a coalition comparable to what FDR and the New Deal did, Ronald Reagan, the conservative movement. And so it goes for Bannon beyond Trump. And the ideas that are part of this MAGA movement, the policies, will all be longer lasting, actually, than Trump himself. But it starts with his running again. And I think when Trump says it, he doesn't not tell us what he's thinking. So I think it's in his head that he'll figure out a way, if possible. And I think in his mind, he will figure out a way if he wants to either run or to run as a partner and then become president with Vice President Vance. So I think it's all very, very real, even with the strategic explanations.
I think you're right. And it's interesting, I think one of the things I learned on my discussion tour for New America, How Should a President Be? 13 stops across the nation. The thing I kept hearing was that he's authentic and that you might not agree with what he says he's doing, but for some reason, the fact that he would really try to do it appealed to people because the faith in the opposition party, the Democratic Party, is so low at this point. And this is something I've been thinking a lot with Mamdani, because a lot of his policies to me, they sound great, but I don't see how he'll accomplish them. But I believe he's going to really try. And so I think that those are two things that we're not recognizing are very similar. More than, Trump and AOC, they've won in the same areas. And so people tend to think, well, what do they have in common? We should look at that. I don't think that's it. I think that's just happens to be like a geographical coincidence in certain areas. I think Mamdani is actually a better representative because of the way he swooped in and sort of beaten the odds and not accepted that the odds were against him.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good comparison politically. Look, I think in thinking of the New York mayoral race and the political style of the era, I guess you can call it. Some of it's policy based. I mean, I just think from Trump to Mamdani to others, what they're touching on is a very real problem in the country that has been discussed. It's been building for decades of economic inequality and insecurity. It's very straightforward. And the politicians who figure out a way to address that in different ways and make that central tend to get a lot of enthusiasm and support, which indicates it's a problem in the country. I mean, I think it's that straightforward. But then, yes, the kind of putting things out there that who knows if they can be done, and just saying I will try to do it and getting that core belief with voters is a commonality, and that too comes from a multi-decade era of distrust in leaders. There's something appealing, I think, to hearing a politician who at some level you believe will try to do even what seems at face value impossible to do.
And so you said that the constant, we all talk about the constant campaigning and how trying it is, but also you've really made a fine point in all of your commentary, I feel like, over the years, to it's blurred the line between electioneering and governing,
Hmm.
right? Because usually you'd run for office, and it used to be on tour to even do that. You'd send, people out for you to go and taste the funnel cakes and such. Has that blurring now made rotation of power feel optional rather than obligatory? Like, Trump is always running. Trump is always the Trump brand. It's not a presidency, it's not an administration, it's a brand.
Well, in terms of the constant running, that's a feature of politics that, I mean, there's many reasons that happened. Part of it was just norms change. Part of it was fundraising and the erosion of campaign finance reforms from Watergate created just endless pressure. So the running isn't just to win votes; it's to make money, campaign money, that is, and then just the way the media works, it's very hard to stop. So you basically see politicians who are perpetually campaigning, even in this case, a lame duck president, which he is. And I actually think you're right in that that creates a different perception of both President Trump because he is campaigning. I mean, it's hard
Yeah.
not to see him as campaigning for 2028 already because that is what he's doing all of the time. But I also think it sells something bigger than him. It's selling. It's not just campaigning, I guess. It's selling the brand. It's selling the political commodity. It's broadening what he has done to an entire generation and beyond. And it makes look it people many have said this, but it makes governing incredibly difficult because if everyone basically is constantly positioning themselves for the next election in an era of very narrow majorities, in an era of narrow electoral college wins, which we're still in. 2024 actually didn't change that. It's very hard to give at all on almost any issue. And the incentives are to fuel the campaign element of politics, anger, emotion, and kind of downplay the other elements, deliberation, negotiation, and the calming effects political leaders can have.
Absolutely, absolutely. There have been some requests for us to reintroduce ourselves. So I'm Alexis Coe. I write Study Mary Kill at Substack. I am a presidential historian, a senior fellow at New America, and the American history columnist at the New York Times Book Review. Julian is the author of many books and a professor of history at Princeton. Am I naming all the titles? Are there
Yes,
more?
and my Substack, The Long View.
Yes. And Substack The Long View.
Yep.
Um, so you have said that Trump's governing style wasn't so unprecedented. And I've talked about this too, that I really want to say that certain things are, definitely unprecedented, but a lot of it is precedented. And I've talked about it more like there are patterns that have emerged, that we have seen bigotry in the office for a long time, that we have seen presidents benefit in ways that they should not have. And this is sort of a snowball effect. And then you get Trump. He's like the monster of, he's Frankenstein's monster of all these different parts put together. But you focus more on the governing style itself. And as like a culmination of long-term institutional decay. And so what sort of distinguishes democratic backsliding, which is something that our colleagues in sort of fascism studies talk about a lot, um, from simple political exhaustion?
It's a good question. I mean, on the first part, I think I always say this: you can find elements of what he's doing, and part of the reason he can do what he does is because there's a foundation for it, and you need to understand that, or else it doesn't really make sense. So that ranges from there is an illiberal tradition in American politics that is very deep and enduring, all the way back to the Republic, and he taps into that rhetorically. He taps into that with his policies and kind of politics of reaction is often very strong. It's as strong as the liberal ideals of the country. So that's a foundation that he taps into. Executive power and using it aggressively is something critics have been warning against over and over. It culminated first with Watergate and Richard Nixon's downfall. There's an era of reform, but we've gone away from that reform, especially since 9/11, as we've rebuilt executive power. And so part of what the president is discovering and many of his staff, like Vought, is that at the OMB, is that there's a lot to play with if you're going to use it. And there are institutional powers a president has that many didn't use. Some did, some said that's too much, but they're there to be exploited. And I think that's another example. And finally, it is a kind of change in the Republican Party that I've traced since the 1980s, where what we're talking about, what I've called the smash mouth approach to partisanship, where you prioritize partisan power above all else, above governing, above the health of political institutions, above abiding by informal norms that other predecessors stuck by, has gradually deteriorated. We saw it with Newt Gingrich in the 80s. We saw it with the Tea Party in the 2010s. And he brought it all together. And he found a party that was willing to say, okay, I mean, he wouldn't be in office if Republicans didn't support him. And so I think kind of that's a way to understand what he's doing kind of with foundations and perspective. Saying all that doesn't mean he's still not finding ways to like take it and go much further than his predecessors. Take federal policing essentially in cities. Even with all the changes we have talked about, presidents in both parties have really been reluctant to do anything like this. They don't want to federalize the National Guard without the consent of elected officials in the states and cities where they're sending them. They don't want to send, as he's now threatening to do, troops at some point. So yes, that power existed. The Insurrection Act is always
Yeah.
given president, but he's using it, and so we kind of balance the unprecedented with the foundations of where his power goes from. Finally, on democratic backsliding. I don't really know the perfect term. I mean,
Yeah.
some people talk about authoritarianism. I tend not to use that yet. Democratic backsliding, a lot of people don't understand what that really means. It's a problematic term. It seems very technical. It captures, though, something essential, that the erosion of democracy is slow and it doesn't happen all at once. It's a kind of a gradual effect that you see where some of the basic pillars of our democracy, rather than building them and strengthening them as we did for a big spell in the 20th century, like the Voting Rights Act of 65, we start taking them away. And you erode the whole political system to the point that maybe it won't be there anymore, or maybe it will be there, but just much easier to exploit by someone who wants to uphold power. So I don't know what the term is, but that's what's happening. And I think it is happening. I think it's spot on. And the voting rights issues we're seeing now in many levels are kind of a prime example of that.
So it's interesting. There's a lot of commentary about how it seems to be happening. So you mentioned something that I want to go back to. It connects all this, which is I like all your books, but one of my absolute favorite that I feel like really speaks to this moment is Burning Down the House, and it burning down the house, yes. And it's what I love about it is you trace this line, you bring it back to Newt Gingrich, and he's this vehicle to show how this happened, right? How did Trump happen? It's not that Trump is some magical being. I mean, he's certainly very good at what he does, but that this was a process. But it couldn't quite be implemented until Trump, right? That he was the conduit for it. He was the vehicle. He was all these things. So some of the questions that people ask and that I get asked all the time is what happens after Trump? Is this over? Um, and to my mind, it would be very hard to do what Trump is doing with a Vance, with a Rubio. If that was possible, it would have happened already. It's not like the money wasn't there. It's not like these think tanks behind it and different, not to besmirch think tanks. I like mine very much, but there are ones that are like very evil. And so I think that there's this tendency to sort of think, is this forever? And in some ways, it strikes me, and this is not the solace that it seems like it is, as there'll just be this pendulum for a while, the way we haven't understood it. We've thought it's been extreme. We thought, oh, going from W and to Obama, that's so extreme. But it's not compared to other countries like Brazil and Argentina and all these, where we've seen these extreme political swings. And everything is not okay. It's kind of like I always say after McCarthyism. It's not like it just ended. It ruined lives. It had effects that permeated our culture for a long time in our politics. So, do you think that is if Trump, of course, we want him to live to the max. I wish him the best of health and nothing else, kind of thing. But do we wish what do we see happening after that? What do we see? What's the post-Trump era like? Whether he, as the oldest president to ever be in office at this point, and will leave as the oldest president whenever he leaves. That is true. That is actually true. Whenever he leaves, he will be the oldest. What happens then? Can Vance just step in? Can Rubio? Or is it really that we're gonna see a swing probably back if there's a good candidate, but they're not going to get away? Do you think
Well,
that's true?
I mean, within the Republican Party itself, I don't imagine it changing dramatically. I think it has changed already. It's what we call MAGA is actually more than a cult of Trump. I think that's not the way to think
Yeah.
of it. It's a set of policies and ideas and a style of politics that has a really deep hold. You just look at the candidates who have won in House and Senate races, and you look at who will be replacement. Maybe Rubio would go back to old Rubio. I doubt it. So I think this Republican Party is going to be pretty He's built a coalition, going back to what we said earlier. I think he's actually fulfilled some of what Bannon talked about, and that coalition will outlast him. Whether someone can be politically successful at bringing that coalition into power or preserving its power, that's a different question. And it isn't hard to imagine, not a pendulum swinging. I don't think it works so easily, but it is possible to imagine a reinvigorated Democratic Party that can seize power, win power from this coalition. Because again, the majorities in Congress, the Electoral College, it remains very tight. And so a muscular party could figure out a way not to change the Republican Party, but to defeat it. And I think that's the question on the table. But we have to remember one important thing, which obviously that the Republican coalition benefits from some of the institutional structure of the country. So the Electoral College gives power and weight to some of the states that are more thinly populated, but essential to the Republican base. Rural areas tend to be in some of the states that really benefit from that. In the Senate, same thing. The two seats per state gives some institutional support to a coalition that doesn't yet, and it could change, but doesn't yet depend on very populated areas that we see in the coast. So I think it's a power struggle rather than a pendulum, and I don't know which way it goes, but there's no reason to think that the power of this coalition will be permanent, even with the changes they're trying to make and all of that. There's lots of room for a fight.
It's interesting because you talk a lot about um, this idea that is sort of at odds. So George Washington, the subject of my last book, was, in his farewell address now, I think I've certainly talked about it more than I ever expected to. He said, that partisanship, what he called factionalism, would give rise to a despot. It would pave the way because parties would only care about consolidating power. They would no longer be as interested in serving their constituencies. And at the same time, you write in defense of partisanship that strong parties are essential to democratic stability. And so and yet it's hard. I mean, I think everyone has this pretty low, not everyone, but a lot of people have a pretty dim view of Congress right now, particularly right now. But so it's hard to see it as stability, but arguably, and you argue it quite well, it can be. They seem to prize loyalty over accountability. And so can partisanship still serve democracy when it's treated like an identity rather than an ideology?
Well, it can. I think it has to be a different kind of partisanship. I mean, we've had parties since the start of the country, never managed not to have them. And parties have not always been this totally destructive. They've served as instruments to kind of channel political division within the political system rather than outside of it. They've generated big ideas in American politics. Ronald Reagan and the Republican conservative revolution, FDR and the liberal. I mean, that is how they come about, and they provide imperfectly some kind of thread through our incredibly divided, fragmented, bizarre constitutional system. We need something to hold, and parties have been what do that. We now have parties that are destructive, and I agree with that, and that's part of what I trace in the book. This hyper partisanship, where all other goals in politics have been put aside, other than the power grab. That is dangerous, and then it bleeds into the culture in that people see each other through a lens that's not, you have this position, I have that position, we'll fight it out, we'll work it out, but then we move on, or then we're still part of a collective. That has faded away. You can say, well, the project should be, how do we totally reimagine politics, get rid of parties, and do something else? I don't think that's really going to happen. These are very ingrained institutions. So the question is, how do we get leaders? How do we reform the system so that we could have a healthy partisanship? Again, have these as institutions that don't bring us into kind of a dangerous state, but instead are the institutions through which we channel our divisions. And the divisions are serious. I'm not one, some are, to believe that these are all imagined. I think there's a lot of differences in this country over basic policies, from reproductive rights to race to economic policies. They have to be hammered out. So I want healthier parties where there are guardrails, where the leaders themselves abide by guardrails, institutionalized guardrails, so they can't go anywhere. that should be the project of this generation. I worry that when you say, or not you, but when people say, let's go beyond, they don't really have an answer. And I just think this is the mechanism our Constitution, our system has become accustomed to. And it doesn't have to be this way. It's kind of mistaking what we have now with what we have to have. And there's just too much history where parties and party leaders, hardened partisans, figured out ways to do this, but also, again, understand there's things they won't do. There are limits to how far they will go, and that's what we need.
I think, and I'm going to have to pop out of the frame for a second to plug in something that has come out, but such as a Substack Live. But I think what's interesting here is just you demonstrate a civic faith, right? When you talk about this, you have a civic faith that I think is really difficult for a lot of us right now. And so I would like, as I pop out of the frame, for you to tell us how you maintain that and how you see this parties becoming this kind of uh, having this productive conflict that I think you're suggesting is necessary and would be lovely to see, because one party, well, it's hard to see what they're doing, and then the other party it increasingly defines legitimacy itself and progress as partisanship. It's saying in response to questions to the press, "Your mom." So, like, that's not productive. It's fun. It is, fun to talk about, we can all admit, but it's not funny, and in fact, I think at this point, it's, like, not that much fun.
Yes, well, you pop out and plug. I mean, in terms of how I think about it, part of it is just more personal. I do have, I even with the severe problems, I do have a faith in this country and its democratic system, which is imperfect, flawed, problematic, but still is one of the best promises of how a democracy can function with a long history at this point behind it. And we have gotten through many incredibly, extraordinarily difficult periods. That is not to say, oh, everything's okay, but it's to say we have the capacity as citizens to work through these moments. Worst was the Civil War, for sure, in terms of total breakdown. But other periods like the 50s and the Red Scare, the 1960s, incredibly fraught and divisive. So part of it is just my understanding and appreciation of the country, which is not, not seeing clearly where we are, but seeing where we have been and what we're capable of doing. Second is there's no alternative. So I can't look at the current moment and throw up my hands. And so the faith comes from an insistence that we have to preserve the republic. And to do that, it requires not accepting this as a permanent status quo. And ultimately, it will require everything from a mobilization of voters to ideas to political leaders who see this differently. In this case, if you are in agreement that the Republican Party as it currently stands is the problem or a major part of the problem, it will require defeating them. That's the kind of beauty of politics. It's sometimes simple. And that's possible. It just happened in 2020. So kind of when people say he'll never be beat, like it just happened a few years ago, and it
Yeah.
can happen again, even with the attacks that are taking place or the kind of efforts to manipulate the system. And finally, you still look around the country, and especially at the gubernatorial level and in city politics and state politics, there's still a lot happening. I mean, I teach students at the graduate level who've been in government and they're going back in government. They get MPAs, it's called, and MPPs. And, a lot of them are leery now about the executive branch, not because they're liberal or conservative. It's just so unstable and
Mhm.
so unpredictable. They're leery, but they see a lot of action taking place in the states on different kinds of questions. And so that's still part of the pulse of this country. It's very much alive. And then finally, I don't know, I see the protests on the No Kings Day, and they're interesting protests because they're not really policy specific. It's
Yeah.
actually this mass protest. It was unbelievably big. really nothing we've seen since Earth Day in 1970, where the fundamental argument of millions of people was not, I want this policy, that policy, and for this, I want the democracy intact, no kings.
Yeah.
And it harkened back to the revolution, to the declaration, a very fundamental idea. So it's still very much there. That's where the faith comes from. And that's how kind of I will continue to see politics. But there's a lot of people like that, and you find them and you talk to them. I don't think everyone has kind of, given up on this democratic experiment.
That's what I found so exciting about No Kings as well. It was, well, I also found the peacefulness of it, particularly in New York City, no arrests. That's incredible. I mean, you could see from the photos, but when you walk, I don't think I've a day in New York, in an area, there have been no arrests, let alone a mass gathering like that. And I think that that is what was most exciting to me is this fact that the unifying issue was democracy, was what the system that we have traditionally had. And you say like no kings, and it seems, and I think this is something that the Democrats and in general the opposition party could be better about, and something that Mamdani I think has really recognized. Yes, this is awful. Yes, we all, this is terrible. There are specific horrific things to talk about. But you can't just be against something. You have to be for something. And so when we say no kings, in some ways it's like love democracy could also be a really good follow-up, march. Maybe we'll work on that branding a little bit. But that, the fact that you make it seem like it's not just, oh, we're in contention with you. It's like, no, we love this. And I think that is a form of patriotism as well that would be really beneficial because people struggle with this idea of patriotism so much. How do I express it? And some people say, I'm a patriot. You're not a patriot. As if, one person has soul, they can say who is and who isn't. And I think that what's really interesting to me as well is that the founders were very much reluctant revolutionaries. These were not the kind of folks you see getting out and risking everything. These were capitalists to the core. They had property to lose. They had, at a time when we were an agrarian society, there's nothing bigger. The seizing of houses was always a risk. One of the many reasons George Washington became the general was because other people were like, well, can you make my family a deal? Like if they catch me, if we lose, will you compensate us for what we lose? And Washington was just like, I'm ready. Let's do this. And so I think it is this is interesting. So I think the reforms of you've shown. I'm going to skip the reforms of the 70s because I think you've spoken to that a little bit. So healthy partisanship is an engine of self-correction, right? So what's the equivalent of maintenance when the engine starts running on resentment? Like how do we give this a tune-up? Is
Well,
it just
some yeah.
vote?
Well, no, I mean, well, first, in terms of what's the project, I think it's a mix of reform and leadership. And so I do think there's reforms, and we don't have to go into all of them that are important. Certainly on Capitol Hill, there's very basic things like I think having this debt ceiling that we created in the early 20th century and have to raise it's become really dangerous. And it's this tool you're putting in front of the parties which needs to be eliminated. I think we need to figure out with these shutdowns, frankly, some way to have continuity in government funding when these differences happen. And there's a whole conversation we had about real campaign finance reforms, things that get to some of the structure important. Part of it's just leadership. It's going to be about people who show how can you be very partisan, but kind of understand these other responsibilities. I do think that's why some people are attracted in New York to Mamdani's candidacy. He's very partisan. He's very progressive by most scales, but there's something about him, not just that he'll try to do what he does. I think people like he's doing it, it seems, in a functional way. And he's thinking about governing and thinking about coalition, talks about the abundance people, Ezra Klein and others. And he's kind of thinking of that, which is very different than what you saw with President Trump and his campaign style, which is just burn everything down and end, period. That's really it. So I think there's lots of examples. I think the gubernatorial races in New Jersey and Virginia have Democrats who are very partisan. They're not being partisan, but they give an air of kind of, I will be responsible with this power and this pursuit of power. And so some of it's just going to be leadership. It's not a magic fix. You just need young people who say this is intolerable at a certain point.
Yes.
In the short term, it's about voting. It still comes down to voting. It's about building a different coalition. And at the same time, it's about all the people we're seeing now, from federal district judges to the groups that help make No Kings possible, who are continuing to just focus on these incredibly problematic areas of what we're seeing at federal level and calling it out, challenging it, even when it seems hopeless. Every federal district judge today is thinking this might hit the Supreme Court and overrule everything I've done, but they're still doing it.
Yeah.
And that process is essential. And ultimately, it's not simply what they do specifically, but you're gradually making a public case through judicial rulings,
Hmm.
through dissents, through protests, that there is another way to handle our partisan divisions, another way to handle our democratic process. And that's the hard work. I mean, last thing, I know I'm going on a lot, but I've studied so many periods of protest, whether it's 19th century abolitionism or the 1960s, anti-war, civil rights, or the 70s, and they're slow. Like, we want it all to happen in a day. It's often years that it takes to build the muscle needed. And I understand the urgency, but
Yeah.
this is just the reality of political opposition and mobilization.
I think it's so interesting that you say this, because I think, one of the things that's so frustrating being outside of Washington is how long things take.
Mm.
But I think what we have learned is it's good when it's not supposed to be a very fast process. It's not supposed to be a business. And we've seen how when things move really fast, this Silicon Valley move fast, break things doesn't work in government. And so I think you're right that there has to be patience. At the same time, there's something you said earlier, and you've sort of been speaking to it, and you've been speaking around it. And I was thinking about it a lot last week because um, we head towards the end of the year, ACA. There are things that have to be resolved as far as health insurance, and this is true for me too. I am. For all these jobs I have, none of them provide benefits. And so I'll be doing this as well. And I'm a single woman. So this is going to be like a pretty large bill every month.
Mhm.
And at the same time, Congress, of course, gives themselves the nicest, the nicest. I read about this in Rolling Stone that they give themselves the nicest healthcare. It's $650, not a month, a year for
Mhm.
concierge service. So they're fine. But I was thinking about it in terms of states. You had said, states have power. We're seeing that. We're seeing states resist. It maybe doesn't look like it because they're being often occupied and saying they do not want that. And so it seems like these governors, they don't maybe have as much power as the president, that everything really comes down. And, arguably there is clearly a lot of there's a power struggle going on. But if five of like the most powerful blue states got together and challenge the healthcare system, they could do it.
Mm.
They could radically change things. And by doing that, they would then really enervate the power of the executive office
Mhm.
and really show them and show America that who you vote in on a local level matters in sometimes more than the president himself. And so the question is, why isn't that happening? This is time, and it's also time for someone who, let's say, is not a Mom Donnie in terms of charisma, right? Is not a Gavin Newsom, but at the same time, I don't want to say that because, like, if Gavin Newsom could be president, I'm a Californian. There's nothing Gavin Newsom hates more. He hates Republicans and homeless people. This has been true my entire life. And if he could be president, I feel like he would have been already. He's definitely always wanted it, quite clearly. But I'm thinking about other Democratic leaders. They could differentiate themselves by saying, like, hey, I may not be the best at clickbait, but I can get something done. It's sort of like I'm thinking about the AOC group, but like it's there is something that could be done here. So why isn't that happening, or is it and we're just not seeing it? I mean, you don't have a crystal ball. You try to stay away, from these power structures as much as I do. But do you see that opportunity, and do you think it's happening?
It's happening to some extent. So this is more cleaning up, though, at this point than kind of new initiatives. And you're seeing compacts between governors to deal with some of what the federal government's doing. You saw it with vaccines. I know here in the Northeast,
Yeah.
the governor of New York and New Jersey, and I can't remember if Connecticut was involved, basically uh, are creating an alternative mechanism to make sure both information and vaccines are available, despite what the federal government has done. Think you're seeing it with this redistricting fight, which I understand is just bare knuckle, politics. But kind of governors are working together for the time being to try to ensure that you can have a level playing field. And I don't know what's taking place. Kind of with deportations there, the governors are at a big disadvantage. I know there's discussions in California, for example. Can police arrest ICE agents, and are there ways to check, those who are kind of abusing their authority? But I think there's some evidence of that, and on the environment, long before Trump, we've seen states either on their own, like California, or working in little clusters, trying to put in the kinds of emissions regulations that the federal government won't do. Obviously, with immigration, that is what sanctuary cities had been about, and an effort to kind of create a more humane system when the federal government wouldn't. The problem, obviously, is it's much harder to coordinate, and some issues like gun control, for example, if you don't do them nationally, it's not really going to work very well because you can move in and out of different places. There's other kinds of benefits that you'll have a race to the bottom if some states don't have the benefits and others do. So it's much messier. That was the reason in the 30s through the 60s we focused on federal action rather than state action. But it is still an avenue. I think you're right. And if you move beyond cleanup and trying to just keep up with Trump, there's a great opportunity for these governors, I think, you're seeing a little with Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania was doing some of this, certainly with infrastructure, and trying to make some of the abundance arguments real in terms of policy. But I think there's much more work that can be done. I think you're right. I mean, ultimately, if a party is just playing defense, is just an opposition movement, you can be successful, but there's limits to building a coalition. People want ideas, they want big things. And if a cluster of governors worked on an area of the country where healthcare premiums that are now about to boom are contained through other forms of subsidies. I think it's expensive and hard to do, but it would really benefit the Democratic Party. And often these big moments we've been through, whether it's the New Deal or the 1980s and conservatism, governors are often doing a lot of what becomes national beforehand. They're testing grounds.
Mhm.
They were called laboratories of democracy in the 1920s and 30s. And so I think you're right. And I think just focusing on Congress right now really won't get Democrats very far, not just to slam the leadership. People have different positions, but they are totally in a defensive mode right now. And so governors have a little more room, and they have constituencies that are inherently more diverse than a gerrymandered House district. So they have room to play. And I think that could be really important to 2028.
To sort of move away from every single headline that we've been
Yeah.
discussing, I wanted to talk about America's turning 250. I've been looking forward to this my entire career. Not what I thought it would be. Not what I thought it would be. Um, there was a moment about 2 weeks in which the Library of Congress had put out the fifth page of the Constitution. And this was in the news a little bit. And I tried to explain to editors like why I thought it was really interesting. And they said, oh, I didn't get that from the news stories. It was just like fifth page, transmittal page, rarely seen on display. And I think the assumption was that it was rarely seen because it just wasn't as important as the previous pages. Or maybe if you come from like a museum background, you think, oh, conservation issues, it can't be on display, which doesn't totally make sense because the other ones can, and they just rotate them out. The thing that I find most interesting about that page has one name on it. It's George Washington, signed very big. And it's seemingly directions, right? It's directions for ratifying the Constitution. Now, I hope I haven't lost many of you. Yes, Dr. Carla Hayden was fired by Trump, and Dr. Carla Hayden is like the most wonderful librarian of Congress that I think we've had in the last, I don't know, couple hundred years. But back to this transmittal page, what I find most interesting about it is that it says it's not okay. Assemblies that are established, local politicians, you're not going to ratify the Constitution, meaning implement it so that it can be more than just, I think, as James Madison called it, like a piece of parchment. That it has to be, you have to find voters, which of course then was landowning white men. You have to find citizens, regular people who do not hold office. You have to make them come in and form these kinds of groups, and only they can ratify the Constitution. Because if the people don't, I hate to use this word, but if the people don't bless this, then it is not going to be any better than anything else we've had, the Articles of Confederation. So what we have here is a document that we think of as being very legal, very, legislative branch, congressional branch, but actually the power was given back to the people who could vote, who owned land. And so I was so taken by that and so bummed that in no way was conveyed in any of the articles about it. And then it was just 2 weeks and it was gone. What is your reaction to that page? And do you think that it would benefit the people, particularly as we celebrate, as President Trump has rolled out, it's just a celebration. As we celebrate, as we approach 250, do documents like this matter? And are we just bad at conveying what they're about?
Well, they matter a lot, and that's why the kind of just general attack on history is so dangerous and what it does. I think that document, that page you're talking about, is very powerful because, I mean, it gets back to the Declaration of Independence that government's legitimacy and authority has to rest on the governed. And even if they imagined a limited governed population, it still mattered. It wasn't Congress and the president. Ultimately, it was the voters, it was the citizenry that would determine, does a republic survive or not. And the argument was, if you don't do that, it's not just that the government kind of won't be legitimate, it will ultimately be fragile. There was a whole history of republics that disintegrated. That's what the founders were obsessed with, and that's why that page is such a really, I think, it's both moving and incredibly important to remember how they were thinking and what the system rests on. Do we do a bad job of taking something like that? I think different people do a good job. I think it's a more local thing, meaning
Yeah.
I don't think going on TV and kind of talking about it will have great effect. But I think there's lots of teachers out in the country and speakers and writers such as yourself who, at smaller levels, which is what we do convey some of that. I think the knowledge of Americans is much better than we often give them credit to, but we can do better, and I think that's a kind of opportunity missed to take a very real document at the moment of celebration, which it should be, not like just patriotic celebration without purpose or without depth and understanding, but really to kind of appreciate, study, and understand how this country has worked, both good and bad. It's a great opportunity. It's a focusing event, an attention event for something like that document. And we do have to think. I mean, I would say, look, it's a changing media world, and a lot of people I know kind of roll their eyes at TikTok or this or Instagram. They don't get it. It's not how they consume, but this is how information is done. And so, yes, find a way to take that document, explain it on a TikTok post is actually fine, and try to draw people into the conversation and the learning. And I think it's incumbent on us. We can complain about the war on history. I do it all the time, but we also have to imagine, articulate how we can do it better, meaning how we can convey the history of this nation in a better way. And if we miss this opportunity, they are, literally only come around,
Yeah.
very sporadically. That would be a mistake. And I still look back to where we started. Yes, everything that we have discussed is happening. But you can still have these conversations. Books are still coming out, classes are still being taught. And so every pocket of intellectual freedom that exists has to be used at the moment of celebration to really talk about what we're celebrating and what the founders talked about. I wrote a post at some point, there's all these attacks these days on critical history, historians who look back at the problems of the country, and that obviously that's like the basis of a lot of the attacks we've seen from the right. But the founders themselves were very consumed with the problematic history of England, of monarchy, and it was the basis of a system that is now revered. So we have to have that kind of serious, clear-eyed look at the past, and that's how we need to talk about it. And I do think, I don't know how you are, but when I talk to audiences, they want to hear that. They're open to that. They're much more mature than some politicians treat them, and capable of taking on nuance and complexity in a way sometimes leaders just disregard.
Absolutely. I think complexity is not a liability, and the problem is that leaders often think that it is, and that they're somehow implicated in something. And I think that's where Trump really shines, is that he in no way, if he's not going to accept something as a bad thing, it's not a bad thing. And I think the same is true with, again, Mamdani. Like, I keep coming back to it because I just see such strength and vitality there. And he's trying different things, but they're also not that different. Um, Something that you brought up, and how I have thought about, and we think about it in New America, that the 250th is really an opportunity to do three things at once. And it's funny because when I say the first one, I have to really quickly say the second, otherwise people get upset, which is pride in the founding, a reckoning for the ways we've fallen short, and aspiration towards a better future. And so two things that and it's funny because something about those three things is missing. So if you are at the extreme where you sort of believe, like, I used to get a lot of, I don't want to study George Washington, he was an enslaver. And then I think one of, like, the greatest successes of my career has been that I got people to read about an enslaver even though they didn't want to, and then they realize it's better to know than not know, because how are you going to win a fight if you're not informed? I've never understood that. But then a reckoning is hard for people, right? So a reckoning is hard for the other group who thinks we should read about him but shouldn't focus on slavery. They find reckoning hard. They find it to be sort of they're somehow implicated in this. And of course, I don't understand that at all, because to me, I'm not related to these people. And even if I was, so what? We are, I guess, all the heirs of the founders in one way or another, but isn't our job to be what they thought we would do, which is continue to grow and fight for the country that we want? They were in contention. Every idea was in contention from from the moment the Declaration of Independence was issued and George Washington wrote out before he could sign it. Every idea was a battle, including his position as commander in chief. And then when the country was established, everyone was fighting over, not only, as you mentioned, sort of they were debating the histories of different countries that they were influenced by, but also the more recent history of this country. And it was always in contention because what the stories we tell about ourselves is, we tell ourselves stories. It's a bunch of different ideas. A Joan Didion quote I'm fumbling through, but what we do is this is all to sort of keep recreating and molding this identity of the American people. And the aspiration for a better future is happening. It's just not necessarily happening how we would want it or what we would define as a better future. But there's this idea that, like, oh, well, we're not able to control those things. So we sort of are opting out or waiting our turn or watching it happen. And that's not civic resistance to me. Civic resistance is believing that you can do all those things at once, even if you are not in power, or you are fundamentally a powerless person. Like, you feel like you have no power because of where you live or your socioeconomic stature or whatever it is. And so I was curious as we end this live, and I thank you so much for your time. Again, I'm Alexis Coe. This is Julian Zelizer. We how what is civic We talked about civic faith. What do you see as civic resistance, and how do you sort of see civics as a verb in your own life and the life of Americans? No, small question.
The basic answer is good history and good civic engagement includes all of those. And if you're just doing part of it, you're inevitably only capturing parts of what the country is about. For me, the most one of the most patriotic moments in recent American history, always I think about, is obviously Martin Luther King standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial with a massive civil rights protest in front of him, calling on America, draped in patriotic symbolism, to fulfill the unfulfilled promises that the country has not engaged in.
Or
That's
what Lincoln
criticism,
said, unfinished business. Like the country
right?
is always unfinished business.
Correct. And so that's a critical look at, really critical look at the country. He had clear eyes on what the problems were. He had suffered them himself. And yet, he was calling on the country to fulfill its promise that was cooked in to the country itself. And that's what we need. That's what the kind of perspective should be. We need to understand the promise and the virtues of the country. We need to understand the failures and the shortcomings, and they might be wrapped up in one person, such as a George Washington, and we can understand both parts of that. And ultimately, the point of understanding that is knowledge itself. But it's how do you take that mix and how do you take that broadly of the history of the country and then turn us to making it better, to doing what King was calling for in 63, to taking this really difficult kind of set of contradictions that all exist in our borders and ultimately moving us toward a better future, which we've done. We have done that time and time again in this country. So that's how I think of kind of the history element of what you're saying, the citizen engagement element of what you're saying. And to go back to the last question, I still believe that there are many more people who are capable of doing that than our politicians act as if exist. And just go into any classroom and talk to students, and they are fully capable of understanding what you're writing about in that book in a way you'd never imagine if you were just watching the news about all the fears of what's going on.
Absolutely. It's funny. I feel like this is coming up a lot, and some of it is me willing it into conversation. But Aaron Sorkin's The American President, which came out before The West Wing. And when I was a little girl, it was a very strange year for me. You'll appreciate this. I think I've told you this before, that the three things I like snuck were in the third and fourth grade were that movie, Contract with America, and Alexis de Tocqueville. Strange, confusing year, but I was very into all three. But the thing that was most interesting to me about the American president, of course, was the famous speech. And I former Representative Will Hurd. I moderated a panel he was on Wednesday, and he actually, to my delight, showed a clip of that speech. And one of the things that Andrew Shepard says in this very moving speech is the president says, citizenship is hard. Everyone expects it to be easy, but it's like the hardest thing in the world because you have to stand next to your neighbor who is saying the most awful things in the world, and you have to defend their right to do so.
Mm.
And that you have to do this and you have to do that. And I think we forget that. And it's really as easy as standing by your neighbors, but believing that you all have the right to say that. And civics can mean so many different things. And I think that's the positive note I want to end on, that it can mean voting. It can mean getting on your school board. It can mean showing up to a meeting to show that there's support for something. It can mean starting a community garden, a free library, whatever it is that has the history books that so many of you said. So many of you are bemoaning that history is not well known. Have a little free library outside your house. Like, we can all do these small actions, and it could have a really big impact. And that's something that I really love about history. And that's why there are many good fictional representations of it, like The American President. But American history itself teaches us over and over again that you can start small and make a really large impact. And so thank you.
Amen.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Right. Um, Thank you so much, Julian. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure as always. Thank you everyone for joining. And I hope that, I hope to hear from all of you about your favorite parts of this and any questions you had. I'm sure Julian does as well. And enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.